lower levels of formality, especially if your target is only maturity level 4. Moving on to the maturity level 5 process areas. Causal analysis and resolution, smaller changes. The word defects has been removed. This is a carryover from the software CMM days. We used to have a process area, a key process area called defect prevention. Then it became causal analysis and resolution, and we said it's the same as defect prevention. The SCI had started to emphasize that it's not just defects, it is other problems or other issues which must be analyzed, or which can be analyzed using CAR practices. Now the focus is on outcomes. Outcomes to improve process performance. So it's neither defects nor problems, but it's purely a focus on outcomes. And that's the biggest change that you can see at the practice level statements. And of course, there's also a little bit of emphasis on evaluating the effect of the actions that is put in. And we'll see that further as we go to the next subsequent slides. The outcomes that SA is now talking about is no longer the negative ones, it's actually both positive and negative outcomes. This process area can be used for both project and organization, nothing very new. But there's an interesting enhancement in specific practice 1.1. When we're saying we want to evaluate for outcomes, the expectation is that we don't just jump from a problem into an analysis, but we clearly state what the problem is, what is the scope of analysis, and what is it that we want to know before we start jumping into detailed analysis. Application of CAR could be a reaction to the situation, that is inability or a potential ability to achieve objectives, or a proactive one, which is done periodically, start of phase, start of activities, or some other period. The specific practice 1.2, which is where the more detailed analysis of the cause and effect relationships is done. The emphasis has been added for using of statistical techniques, process performance baselines and models. And the evaluation of effects would also be using statistical techniques to evaluate if there is a statistically significant change for achieving the objectives. There's an interesting addition which is coming. And this is interesting from my point of view because I've had appraisals where people say, I have some failure cars. Can they come in for the appraisal? What's a failure car? When we tried it, it didn't work out. But we did the practices. And it's not necessary that everything you try will work out. So what is done is actually an addition which says that when you have results which was not what you expected, identify, document, follow up action so that you can at least move forward. The last of the process areas for high maturity, and this is the, what should I say, the new model of the OID, Organizational Innovation and Deployment. The first goal has been added, but let's just see the purpose statement. The purpose statement itself has been written. We're not talking about selecting, deploying incremental innovative improvements, etc. It's a simpler statement. It just says proactively manage the organization's performance to meet business objectives, which does change things a bit. You're talking about linking it to real world data, what happens in real life. Again, Ravi's presentation was actually highlighting those things and showcasing how the improvements have affected performance of the business. I'm not sure share value is the indicator, but because you did mention that too. But the other indicators definitely would be examples of managing the business performance and linking it to business objectives. The specific goal statement, it's a new goal, so I'll just go through these practices quickly. It talks about managing the business performance using statistical and other quantitative techniques to understand shortfalls and therefore identify improvements. I've got an underline, explain that in a minute. The three practices that have been added, I see some, I've put it in red because this is my interpretation, I see some correlations with what was there earlier in version 1.2, but I can't put in exact words or phrases out there. The three practices are to do with establishing business objectives, and building suitable business strategies, analyzing performance data, and then identifying potential improvements. But the reason I've written this together and what I'd like to highlight is none of the three practices in their practice statements talk about using statistical techniques. And yet, the goal does. This is possibly the only place, or the only few places, I have one more place to show, in the model where the goal could sometimes be more than the sum of the practices. I was there in March at the SCI, and this was also pointed out, and people thought this was a bug in the model documentation. Because finally, how can you have statistical management at the goal level, or using the statistical techniques at the goal level without any statistical techniques being mentioned at the practice level? And what was pointed out was interesting. It is not possible to state definitively or in definitive terms which of these practices must use statistical techniques. But it is expected that across these practices, one more, whichever ones, statistical techniques or other quantitative techniques will be used so that you can establish linkages and therefore have higher confidence towards it. You can see almost a similar thing for goal 2, where I've highlighted statistical and the quantitative techniques. It's not directly into the practice statements, but organizational process management, organizational performance management. Goal 2 is very much goal 1 of version 1.2 for organizational innovation and deployment. Strong levels of commonality. A few things that I've highlighted. SP 2.1, which is related to SP 1.1 in my opinion, and even SP 1.2, now talks about elicitation besides just collection. The basic flow is elicit, analyze, validate, and then select and implement. So that's the things that are getting linked to the goal statement. Goal 3 talks about deployment. I don't see too many changes except for highlights relating to usage of statistical and quantitative techniques, both in the goal statement as well as the practice statement. So a few things that are coming out. In OPM, our quantitative process performance objectives and business objectives must support business outcomes. There is no formal statement that there needs to be statistical analysis to relate it to the business outcomes, but there must be meaningful linkages so that you can relate performance towards achieving goals to the performance of the organization. This can require continual and iterative analysis of data and possibly usage of process performance baselines and models, both to see how well we are doing it, are we continuing to be capable to achieve the objectives or the needs of the business, and if not, to select improvements. The idea is also to maintain a long-term focus for doing this activity and therefore planning with a long-term view to continually achieve objectives which would be getting revised or improved upon for the organization. Looking at the goals, I briefly covered the practices. First part would be to maintain business objectives that are relevant. Just this week I finished a training and we were talking about in a case study identifying objectives, and this was for same for services. So the case study was to do with a resort, and one of the teams said, "My objective is 0 cancellations." I said, "So, but what does the business need?" I said, "It's 0 cancellations." So I said, "Okay, so you have 0 reservations, and therefore you have 0 cancellations. Is that adequate?" So it's not just a number of 0 cancellations which is important. It is actually knowing what the business is about and what delivers.